Hunger. For 10,000 years, the Imperium of man has known the Tyranid only as hunger-given form. They are the Great Devourer, a faceless, mindless tide that strips worlds of bedrock, driven by a synaptic will as cold and distant as the void between galaxies. They do not hate. They do not scheme. They simply eat. But in the dark reaches of the Segmentum Tempestus, the shadow in the warp has changed. The scream of the Hive Mind has been silenced, replaced by a singular, psionic voice that chills the blood of librarians and Eldari farsers alike. The swarm no longer moves with the chaotic instinct of a predator. It marches with the precision of a conqueror. From the biomass pools of a corrupted Splinter Fleet, a new apex has risen. She is not of this galaxy. She is the anathema to the Hive Mind's unity. She has wings of bone, hair of tendrils, and a will that breaks the stars themselves. The Devourer has found his queen, and the galaxy shall knell. The communion was absolute, a sacred drowning in the ocean of the star children. Magus Malachian knelt in the obsidian dust of the mining pit, his third arm twitching in rhythmic ecstasy as he channeled the brood mind. For generations, his cult, the Sons of the Silent Void, had prepared this world for the day of ascension. They could hear the approaching hum of Hive Fleet Leviathan, a billion-voice choir singing of unity and consumption. It was a soundless vibration that rattled the teeth and warmed the cold, void-touched blood in his veins. But then, in the span of a single heartbeat, the music died. It did not fade, it was severed. A psychic scream of impossible magnitude tore through the Empyrean, a shearing sound like the breaking of a god's spine. Malachian convulsed, blood jetting from his nose and ears as the connecting thread to the Great Devourer was violently snapped. Around him, the acolytes collapsed, clutching their skulls, wailing as the warm embrace of the Hive Mind was replaced by a cold, terrified silence. The psychic backlash was not merely a loss of signal. It was an amputation. The shadow in the warp had not dissipated. It had been murdered. Chaos erupted in the subterranean catacombs. Without the stabilizing will of the synapse, the divine biology of the Tyranids reverted to base, animalistic rage. The Patriarch, a hulking demigod of claw and chitin that Malachian had worshipped as a grandfather, roared, a sound devoid of intelligence, filled only with primal hunger. The beast turned on its own kin. With a swipe of rending claws that could shear through ceramite, the Patriarch bisected a hybrid neophyte, painting the rock walls with darker-than-human arterial spray. The cavern became a slaughterhouse of confusion. Purist-strained genestealers, once the silent assassins of the cult's will, began to hiss and snap at one another, their telepathic coordination shattered. Malachian scrambled backward to muck, his forestaff sputtering with erratic warp energy. He watched in horror as the carefully orchestrated hierarchy of the cult dissolved into a frenzy of feral violence. The star gods were not here to save them. The star gods had gone deaf, dumb, and blind. The sanctity of the ascension had been replaced by the banal reality of being locked in a cage with starving apex predators. Above the screaming and the wet tearing of flesh, a new sound manifested, a sonic boom that cracked the basalt ceiling of the open pit mine. The atmosphere of the planet did not burn with the typical spore pods of mycetic invasion. Instead, the sky was torn open by a rift of violet energy, distinct from the roiling madness of the warp. It was precise, surgical, and terrifyingly alien. An object plummeted from the rift, wreathed in psionic fire, slamming into the center of the mining pit with the force of a tectonic hammer. The impact threw Malachian and the Pharaoh Patriarch alike into the walls. Dust and vaporized rock obscured the impact zone, but the silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with a new kind of pressure. It was not the mindless hunger of the Tyranid swarm. It was a presence of overwhelming, ego-driven will. The air tasted of ozone and copper. The feral Tyranids stopped their infighting, turning their eyeless heads toward the crater, sensing a predator that eclipsed their own biological imperatives. The smoke began to swirl, moved not by the wind, but by a telekinetic hand. From the center of the crater, a figure rose. She was humanoid in silhouette, a mockery of a human form elevated to biological perfection. Wings of segmented bone and membranous flesh extended from her back, dripping with a thick, purple ichor that hissed as it touched the ground. Her hair was a crown of writhed, segmented tendrils, moving with a life of their own. The feral patriarch, driven by instinctual territorial rage, shrieked and charged the intruder. It was a creature designed to kill tanks, a blur of muscle and razor-sharp talons. The figure did not flinch. She did not even raise a hand. Her eyes, glowing with a luminance that burned the soul, narrowed slightly. The patriarch stopped mid-charge, suspended in the air by invisible bands of crushing force. Its carapace began to crack, the sound like gunfire in the quiet pit. With a sickening wet crunch, the massive beast was folded on itself, imploded by a thought, its biomass dropping uselessly to the floor. The Queen of Blades lowered her gaze to the trembling cultists. Malakian felt the intrusion immediately. It was not the subtle, creeping influence of the brood mind, nor the overwhelming ocean of the hive. This was a spear of ice driven directly into his frontal lobe. It was singular. It was arrogant. It was her. He looked up, tears of joy and terror streaming down his pale face, as the purple glow of her eyes seemed to dissect his very being. The feral genestealers around him lowered their claws, their animalistic hissing silenced, as their synaptic pathways were forcibly rewritten, hijacked by a frequency far more potent than the Norn Queen's Leviathan. The Queen stepped forward, her heels clicking on the stone, the organic heels fusing with the ground to spread a carpet of living, violet creep. Her voice resonated not just in the air, but inside his skull, clear, imperious, and terrifyingly human. "The silence is over," she projected, the words carrying the weight of 1,000 devoured worlds. "Your gods were merely animals. I am the evolution. I am the swarm." Malakian bowed his head to the dirt, weeping, as the first true queen of the Tyranids claimed her new brood. The logic engines of this unit struggled to process the biological heresy unfolding within the digestion pits. Standard Tyranid predation protocols dictate the reduction of all biomass into a raw, soup-like gruel to be siphoned into the orbiting hive ships. This is not what occurs here. The fluids in the reclamation pools have shifted from a standard acidic green-yellow to a deep, bruising violet. The substance is viscous, semi-sentient, and undeniably aggressive. It does not merely dissolve organic matter. It infects the very soil, spreading a carpet of living tissue, a creep, that suffocates the native flora not to consume it, but to replace it. The ground breathes. Veins of bioluminescent purple throb beneath the rockcrete of the captured refinery, pumping nutrients with the rhythm of a planetary heartbeat. The capillary towers, usually destined to drain the world dry, have sealed their sphincters. They are no longer straws for a distant fleet. They are becoming roots for a new, terrestrial ecosystem. The Great Devourer has ceased to dine and has begun to nest. The entity, identified as the Apex Queen, stands at the edge of the primary spawning pool, her silhouette distorted by rising heat hazes of genetic recombination. This unit's Auspex scans detect a viral payload of impossible complexity radiating from her. She does not utilize the slow trial-and-error evolution of the Norn Queens. Her method is invasive, immediate, and violent. She severs a limb from a still-living Tyranid warrior and casts it into the pool, followed by a secretion of her own golden-orange essence. The reaction is catastrophic. The biomass boils. The Tyranid double helix, a masterpiece of ancient adaptability, is torn apart and forcibly spliced with a hyper-aggressive foreign strain. The genetic sequences war for dominance in a microscopic apocalypse, but the foreign strain, the Zerg sequence, conquers with ruthless efficiency. It does not erase the Tyranid genome. It enslaves it, optimizing the protein chains for speed and psionic conductivity, rather than mere durability. The birthing sacs rupture prematurely, tearing open with a wet sound of tearing canvas. What spills forth is an abomination of dual lineage. It is a hormigaunt in base structure, but the modifications are grotesque. The bounding gait is preserved, yet the carapace is thickened, evolving groove plates capable of storing pressurized spines. The scything talons remain, but the creature's upper torso has expanded, housing new muscular distinctness reminiscent of the Hydralis genus. Most terrifying is the eyes. Standard gaunts possess the dull, vacuous stare of a drone slave to a synapse. These creatures possess pupils that contract with predatory focus. They look at one another, chittering in a complex, localized language. They are testing their new limbs, flexing spines that drip with neurotoxin. The efficiency of the Tyranid swarm has been coupled with the individualistic savagery of the Zerg. They are no longer ammunition to be spent. They are soldiers to be commanded. To manage this new breed, the Apex Queen has rejected the Hive Mind synapse creature hierarchy. She deems a reliance on towering hive tyrants a tactical weakness, a single point of failure. Instead, she is cultivating brood mothers. I observe a zoanthrope, its bulbous cranium pulsing with warp sickness, being dragged into the central chrysalis. It screams as a creep invades its orifices, rewriting its purpose. When the chrysalis splits, the creature that emerges is no longer a floating conduit for the warp. It is a grounded, multi-limbed matriarch, bloated with egg sacs and dripping with synaptic slime. It does not merely relay the queen's will, it interprets it. These brood mothers are designed to possess autonomy, capable of strategic adaptation, without the need for the Apex Queen's direct oversight. The centralization of the hive mind is being dismantled, replaced by a feudal system of biological warlords, each fanatically loyal to the Queen of Blades. Alert. Proximity alarm // biosignature detected. The landscape of the agri-world is unrecognizable. In the distance, where the spiraling hive cities of the Imperium once stood, massive organic structures are erupting from the crust. These are not the spore chimneys of a dying world. They are hatcheries, pulsing, living fortresses of bone and sinew that pump out armies independently of the fleet in orbit. The Tyranids are transitioning from a nomadic locust swarm into an entrenched occupational force. They are fortifying. The ground beneath my sensor unit trembles. The creep has reached my location. It burns. It holds me fast. Visual feeds are distorting. A shadow falls over the lens. One of the new hybrids stand before me. Its cowl flaring, its mandible dripping with acid. It does not strike immediately. It studies me. It learns. The transmission must end. The Imperium must know. The destroyer has not come to eat. She has come to build. Transmission terminated // unit lost. The astropathic choir of the Fortress World Vigilance Prime did not scream. That would have been mercy. When the shadow in the warp usually descends, it is a tsunami of white noise, a billion hungry voices drowning the soul in static until the mind snaps. This was different. In the candlelit sanctorum, 50 blind telepaths, bound a golden throne by neural whips and duty, suddenly ceased their chanting. They levitated in unison, feet hovering inches above the cold marble, their emaciated bodies rigid as rigor mortis. Inquisitor Valeria, standing in the observation gallery, felt the temperature in the room drop 20 degrees in a second. Frost crawled across the brass piping of the life support systems. Then the choir spoke. They did not speak with 50 voices, but with one, a voice that was feminine, cold, and laced with an arrogance that predated the Imperium. Come, the choir intoned, blood weeping from their sewn-shut eyelids. Bear witness. Then, simultaneously, their heads exploded. The psychic backlash blew out the lumen strips, plunging the spire into darkness, leaving Valeria standing in a rain of brain matter and prophecy. The coordinates burned into her mind were not a distress call. They were an invitation. The transition from the warp to real space was nauseatingly smooth, a testament to the machine spirit of the Dauntless-class light cruiser. His will be done. Usually, entering a system under Tyranid assault meant emerging into a debris field of shattered hulls and frozen corpses. But the system was pristine, silent. Valeria stood on the command bridge, her hand resting on the pommel of her power sword, her knuckles white. Auspex reports. She barked, her voice cutting through the nervous hum of the bridge crew. The sensor servitors, hardwired into the ship's cogitators, twitched as they processed the data. My lady, the Vox officer stammered, fear cracking is conditioned discipline. No engagement alarms. No bioplasma signatures. But the third planet. The readings are impossible. Valeria stepped up to the main oculus. The tactical hololith flickered to life, displaying the agri-world of Tarsus IV. It should have been a gray, lifeless rock, stripped of atmosphere and water by the Hive Fleet. It wasn't. It was vibrant. It was pulsing. It was a bruise in the void, covered in swirling violet storms and continents of creeping, organic growth. They hadn't eaten the world. They had conquered it. Bring us the high anchor. Silent running, Valeria ordered, her dread mounting. As the cruiser drifted closer, the magnification screens revealed the horror of the surface. The Imperium understood the Tyranid as a locust, a force of consumption. But down there, amidst the ruins of imperial cathedrals, the Xenos were building. Massive, ribbed structures, towers of bone and throbbing sacks, pierced the cloud layer, venting gases to terraform the atmosphere. Roads of purple creep connected these hives, along which columns of bioforms moved with military precision. There was no frenzied feeding. It was industry. Valeria watched as a massive organism, resembling a bloated worm, vomited refined minerals into a spawning pool. "They are mining," she whispered, the realization chilling her more than the void outside. "They are establishing supply lines. Logistics." A xeno-species that relied on instinct was a natural disaster. A xeno-species that understood logistics was an existential threat to the throne itself. "Contact!" the Master of Arms shouted. Multiple biosignatures rising from the gravity well. Interceptor class. The bridge bathed in the red wash of klaxons. On the screens, a squadron of winged horrors, mutalisks. The cogitator tagged them, though the silhouette was wrong. Shot from the atmosphere. They moved in a delta formation. "Shields up. Prepare point defense batteries," the captain roared. But the creatures did not fire. They did not ram. They swept past the His will be done, barrel rolling with the grace of Eldari fighters, flanking the cruiser on both sides. They were escorting them. A sudden, piercing pressure clamped down on Valeria's mind, bypassing her mental bastions. It wasn't an attack. It was a gaze. She felt herself being examined, weighed, and judged by an intellect vast and ancient. "You are small." The voice echoed in her skull, sounding like the rustle of dry leaves and the snap of breaking bone. "Go. Tell your stagnant emperor that the game has changed. Tell him I am coming." The escort broke formation and dived back to the planet, leaving the cruiser untouched in the void. The silence on the bridge following the encounter was heavier than the grave. The crew looked to Valeria, waiting for the order to commit exterminatus, to burn the planet before the infection could spread. But Valeria stared at the retreating bioforms, her tactical mind racing. Cyclonic torpedoes would be useless. The planetary void shields, biological variants generated by the floating brain beasts, were already active. She had seen the shimmering, distinct distortion in the upper atmosphere. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a border dispute. "Navigator," Valeria said, her voice trembling slightly before she steeled it with the ice of her rosette. "Plot a course for segment and command. Priority Ultra." She looked back at the purple marble hanging in the dark. The Tyranids had learned the one thing that made the Imperium dangerous. War is not just about killing. It is about holding ground. The Great Devourer had stopped eating. It had started empire building. And God Emperor helped them all. It was waiting for a challenge. Colonel Vance of the Cadian 812th Iron Roots wiped a smear of oily rainwater from his spectacles, his boots squelching in the thick, sucking mud of the trench line. The agri world of Demeter's Rest had been turned into a fortress of earthworks and razor wire. 3 regiments of the Imperial Guard stood shoulder to shoulder, a wall of flak armor and lost guns stretching for 20 miles across the grain fields. Behind them, the Earthshaker cannons of the Basilisk artillery batteries hammered a rhythmic thunder, sending high-explosive shells screaming into fog-shrouded tree line 5 kilometers away. This was a standard doctrine, the hammer of the Emperor, against Tyranids. The strategy was simple: drown the mindless tide in fire before it reached the lines. Vance checked the power pack of his bolt pistol, the machine spirit humming with reassuring warmth. He expected the roar. He expected the horizon to turn into a carpet of chittering claws and gnashing teeth, a mindless charge that would break itself against the discipline of Cadia. "Steady, lads," he grumbled, his voice amplified by the Vox bead. "Let them come to the slaughter. Fire it while on my mark." But the roar did not come. The shells pounded the forest, churning dirt and wood, but they struck no flesh. 30 minutes passed. The artillery ceased fire, the barrels of the basilisks glowing cherry red in the drizzle. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the bombardment. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. In a typical engagement, the Tyranids would be screeching, driven by a synaptic hunger that overrode all self-preservation. But the sensors of the Auspex scanners remained frustratingly clear of movement. Cogitator error? Vance barked at his Voxcaster. The boy shook his head, face pale. No, sir. Thermal is negative. Motion is negative. They aren't attacking, sir. They're waiting. A shiver ran down Vance's spine. Tyranids did not wait. Tyranids did not understand the concept of a siege or stalemate, unless they weren't just animals anymore. The fog in the distance began to swirl, not with wind, but with a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't the sound of charging feet. It was the sound of the earth grinding its own teeth. The attack did not begin at the front. It began underneath. The ground beneath the heavy weapons platoon, 50 yards to Vance's left, suddenly liquefied. There was no warning tremor, just a violent eruption of rock and soil as a massive, serpentine horror burst from the crust. It was a Moloch, but mutated. Its maw was wider, its carapace glistening with the purple sheen of the new queen's brood. It didn't just strike, it acted as a breachhead. From the tunnel it created, a flood of smaller organisms poured out, bypassing the kill zones entirely. These were not the clumsy gaunts of old. They moved with the fluid, darting speed of Zerglings, their adrenal glands pumping them full of hyperstimulants. Ambush! Rear guard, pivot. Vance screamed, firing his bolt pistol into the mass. But the coordination was flawless. As the guard turned to face the breach, the tree line finally exploded. The main force hadn't been pinned down. They had been holding position, waiting for the distraction. The trap snapped shut with the precision of a steel jaw. The bunkers on the ridgeline, reinforced with void-hardened plasteel, were the only things holding back the tide. Their heavy bolters chugged rhythmically, turning the approaching swarm into green mist. Then the colonel saw them. Rolling out of the fog were creatures he had never seen in any Tactica Imperialis. They looked like bloated ticks the size of a chimera transport, their abdomens distended with glowing, volatile green fluid. They did not bite or claw. They rolled, tucking their limbs in to become biological bowling balls, ignoring the lost fire that scored their thick hides. Focus fire on the bloaters. Vance roared, but it was too late. The lead creature slammed into the command bunker. It didn't impact. It detonated. The explosion was not fire, but a wave of hyperconcentrated acid that dissolved ferrocrete instantly. The bunker didn't collapse. It melted. Screams of men liquefying inside their armor cut through the din of battle, a sound so horrific it caused the morale of the adjacent platoon to shatter instantly. These bandlings were suicide weapons, traded freely by a commander who understood that one dead bioform was a cheap price for a strategic breach. The line disintegrated. It was not a retreat. It was a rout. The tactical cohesion of the Cadian 812th dissolved under the dual pressure of the subterranean flank and the acid bombers. Vance found himself back-to-back with his commissar, swinging his power sword to the chitin of a leaping warrior. The mud was slick with blood and the glowing green sludge of the Xenos. "Fall back to the secondary line," the commissar shouted, before a scything Talon took his head from his shoulders in a clean, surgical strike. Vance stumbled, looking up at the sky. Through the smoke and rain, he saw the synapse creatures, floating zoanthropes, watching. They weren't casting lightning. They were observing, directing the smaller beasts to cut off escape routes. They were herding the guardsmen into kill boxes. As a swarm of the Zerg hybrid gaunts overran his position, Vance's final thought was not the Emperor, but the terrifying realization that the galaxy's greatest predator had just learned the art of war. The Corvus Black Star Shadows Talon screamed through the vacuum, its assault ramps trembling as it punched to the membranous outer dermis of the Hive ship. Watch Captain Artemis of the Death Watch clamped his magnetic boots to the deck, his helmet's auto-senses filtering out the shrill alarm of the proximity Auspex. "Brace for impact," he growled, his voice a grinding tectonic plate over the Vox. "Target is the Norn Queen. Decapitation strike. No mercy. No hesitation." The gunship didn't land. It crashed, burying its adamantium nose deep into the fleshy interior of the Bio-Titan. With a hiss of depressurization and a roar of explosive bolts, The assault ramp dropped. Artemis was the first out, his guardian spear, the thirst already spinning to decapitate a lunging warrior beast. But as the kill team fanned out, 5 Astartes drawn from the finest chapters, clad in black ceramite, they faltered. This was not the dry, rib bone architecture of a standard Tyranid vessel. The walls were weeping. Thick, purple mucus coated every surface, pulsing with a rhythmic heat that fogged their visors. The air was thick with spores, but they didn't smell of rot. They smelled of accelerated growth. Auspex is blind, reported Brother Valerius of the Raven Guard. The psychic static is, it's singing. They move with the transhuman speed of the Astartes, a blur of bolter fire and power armor through the arterial corridors. The resistance was suspiciously light. There were no floods of gaunts, no clogging swarms to slow them down. Instead, the ship seemed to be shepherding them, the muscle sphincter doors opening before they could even place melta-charges. It's a trap, hissed Brother Ignis of the Salamanders, his heavy flamer pilot light flickering in the damp air. We are being invited in. Artemis knew he was right. The tactical display on his retina pulsed with a single, massive biosignature ahead in the central synaptic chamber. It was a beacon of such raw psychic power that it registered as a thermal bloom. Titan formation, Artemis ordered. Whatever is in there wants us to find it. Let us not disappoint the Xenos' filth. They breached the final membrane, stepping into a cathedral of bone and purple flesh, vast enough to house a Titan. And there, waiting for them, was the Royal Guard. They were not Tyrant Guard. They were monstrosities of chitin and muscle that defied the Muggles' biologist classifications. Standing 4 meters tall, these beasts possessed a hulking silhouette of a carnifex, but with massive, tusk-like scything blades protruding from their jaws, living siege engines. The closest analog in the data slates was a mythical ultralisk of the anomaly reports. Contact! Artemis roared as the beast charged. The speed was impossible for creatures of that mass. Brother Korg of the Space Wolves met the charge head-on, his frost axe biting into the chitin, but the beast didn't slow. With a toss of its massive tusks, it caught the Astartes mid-air and slammed him into the wall with enough force to crack the ship's ribs. Bolter rounds detonated harmlessly against their carapace. Ignis bathed the area in promethium fire, but the creatures simply walked through the flames, their regeneration factors knitting flesh back together seconds after it burned. It was a brawl of demigods, ceramite against hypervol bone, and for the first time in centuries, the Death Watch was losing the physical contest. Enough! The word wasn't spoken. It was a psychic hammer blow that dropped the kill team to their knees. The Ultralisks halted instantly, freezing like statues. From the shadows of the nerve stem at the back of the chamber, she descended. The wings of bone spread wide, casting a silhouette that triggered deep, primal fear even in the psycho-conditioned minds of the Astartes. Kerrigan floated toward them, her feet not touching the creep-covered floor. Artemis fought the pressure crushing his skull, forcing his servomotors to whine as he raised his guardian spear. He fired. The bolt shell, a mass reactive penetrator designed to kill gods, sped toward her head. It stopped inches from her face, suspended in a violet field of telekinetic force. She looked at the round, curious, then flicked her eyes to Artemis. The bolt crumbled into dust. "You bring bullets to a battle of the mind," she said, her voice echoing from every wall. "Typical of your species. So loud, so crude." Artemis roared, thumbing the activation rune of his power field, and charged. He was a veteran of 1,000 wars, a slayer of warlords and hive tyrants. He closed the distance in a heartbeat, swinging the spear in a lethal arc meant to sever her head. Kerrigan didn't dodge. She caught the power blade with her bare hand, her psionic skin hardening to diamond density. The energy field of the weapon sparked and died. With a casual flick of her wrist, she shattered a half of the ancient weapon and backhanded Artemis across the room. He struck the ground, his breastplate shattered, his primary heart seizing. He looked up, expecting the killing blow. Instead, the Ultralisk stepped back, clearing a path. Kerrigan hovered over him, her eyes burning with the cold light of a collapsing star. "I could add your essence to the pool," she mused, "but you are more useful as a messenger. Go back to your golden throne. Tell your corpse god that I do not wish to burn his galaxy, unless he stands in my way. Now run." The air pressure reversed, and the kill team was telekinetically hurled back down the corridor, expelled from the presence of the Queen like unwanted refuse. Amon Harak, Ranger of Alatak, adjusted the magnification rune on his long rifle, his breath misting on the scope's lens. He lay prone on the obsidian ridge of the dead moon Xerxes, wrapped in a chameleon cloak that shifted texture to match the jagged rock. He had hunted the Great Devourer for 3 centuries. He had seen it consume maiden worlds and strip craft worlds to bone, but he had never seen it fight itself. The sky above the moon was not black. It was a bruising, infected swirl of biological debris. 2 distinct atmospheric layers clashed in the stratosphere, the white and purple spore clouds of Hive Fleet Leviathan, the Loyalist Brigation Force, attempting to smother the violet, psionically charged atmosphere generated by the usurper. It was a war of biospheres. The silence that plagued the sector was broken by a psychic roar so deafening that Amon's spirit stone pulsed hot against his chest. The Hive Mind had arrived to amputate its gangrenous limb. Millions of mycetic spores rained down like hail, not to eat the planet, but to kill the things that lived there. 2. The valley floor below became a canvas of biological heresy. From his vantage point, Amon witnessed a clash of philosophies written in blood and ichor. To the north surged the Leviathan horde, a sea of porcelain-white carapaces and purple flesh, moving in perfect, mindless unison. They were a wave, relying on weight of numbers and the crushing will of the synapse. To the south rose the usurper's brood. They were darker, mottled with the earthy browns and bruised purples of the Zerg strain. They did not move as a wave. They moved as a pack. Amon watched as a phalanx of Leviathan termagants unleashed a volley of flesh-borer beetles. In response, the usurper's forces, creatures that resembled hormagaunts but with the needle-spine crests of hydralisks, did not simply absorb the fire. They scattered. They used cover. They flanked. It was terrifying to behold. The Zerg-strained beasts leaped with adrenal-fueled distinctness, tearing into the rigid formations of their cousins with savagery that seemed personal. It was the rigidity of an ant colony shattering against the cunning of a wolf pack. 3. The air war escalated into a blinding storm of leather wings and bioacid. Clouds of gargoyles darkened the sun, a chaotic maelstrom of screeching beasts. But then, the anomaly manifested. High above the fray, a singular point of light ignited the Queen. She was a speck to the naked eye, but through Amon's scope, she was a radiant avatar of warp energy. She raised her hands, and the clouds obeyed. This was not the chaotic warp lightning of a zoanthrope. It was a disciplined execution of the elements. A psionic storm erupted. Bolts of indigo lightning, precise as lances, raked across the sky, specifically targeting the flocking instincts of the Leviathan flyers. Thousands of gargoyles simply ceased to exist, their nervous systems fried instantly, turning into a rain of ash. The storm did not touch her own forces. Amon lowered his rifle, trembling. The Eldari farcer spoke of the great dragon as a mindless hunger. This was a sorcerer queen, for the ground shook with a rhythmic thud that dislodged rocks from Amon's hiding spot. The Leviathan fleet, sensing its swarm was being outmaneuvered by superior tactics, played its king. A massive tyrannocyte, scarred and ancient, slammed into the center of the battlefield, crushing friend and foe alike. The fleshy walls of the pod peeled back like a blooming flower of death, revealing the Swarmlord. The beast was magnificent and terrible, standing twice the height of a carnifex, wielding for serrated bone sabers that crackled with the green energy of the Hive Mind's pure spite. It threw back its head and let out a challenge that rippled through the warp, temporarily stunning the lesser Zerg beasts. This was the herald of the Great Devourer, the genetic accumulation of 1 billion wars, spawned for one purpose: to cull the alpha that had gone rogue. 5. The reaction from the usurper's forces was immediate and chilling. They did not rush the Swarmlord. Instead, the Zerg-strain bioforms pulled back, creating a wide, empty circle in the center of the carnage. The chaotic melee dissolved into a gladiatorial arena. The Swarmlord stood alone in the clearing, its swords weaving a defensive pattern, confused by the sudden withdrawal of its prey. It expected a swarm, it got a duel. Across the field of corpses, the Queen of Blades descended. She touched down on a pile of slain Tyranid warriors, her wings folding tight against her back. She did not look like a monster. She looked like a duelist. Amon zoomed in on her face. She was smiling. It was a cold, human expression of anticipation. The Hive Mind screamed in Amon's mind, a sound of absolute hatred. But the Queen simply cracked her neck and ignited a blade of pure psionic energy in her hand. The Ranger whispered prayer to Isha. The gods were about to bleed. The impact shook the tectonic plates of the moon. The Swarmlord moved with a speed that mocked physics, a blurred whirlwind of ivory chitin and green warp fire. It was the ultimate expression of biological warfare, a creature that had bested the chapter master of the Ultramarines and slaughtered the Avatar kind. It did not fight with anger. It fought with the cold, calculated precision of a supercomputer programmed to dismantle prey. Kerrigan met the assault, her wing blades flashing like scythes of doom, parrying the four-boned sabers that wove a lattice of death around her. Sparks of psychic energy showered the battlefield as the alien weapons clashed. Tyranid bone, hardened by the death of galaxies, against Zerg carapace, forged in the fires of Xera's crucible. The Swarmlord fainted with his upper right limb, a blindingly fast strike meant to decapitate, while the lower left saber swept low to hamstring. Kerrigan backflipped, her wings acting as stabilizers, but the tip of the bone saber grazed her cheek, drawing a line of glowing purple blood. The Swarmlord did not pause. It pressed the advantage, its movements synchronized by the Hive Mind's combat algorithms, treating the Queen of Blades not as a goddess, but as a biological error to be corrected. For the first time since her ascension, Kerrigan felt the stinging bite of mortality. This creature was not a mere beast. It was a peer. The Swarmlord roared, unleashing a psychic scream. The paroxysm, intended to overload her nervous system with phantom pain. Kerrigan staggered, her psionic shield flickering under the assault. In that microsecond of vulnerability, the Swarmlord struck. One of the massive sabers plunged into her shoulder, punching through the chrysalis-hardened plating and pinning her to the obsidian ground. The pain was searing, absolute. The Leviathan swarm shrieked in triumph, a billion voices celebrating the fall of the usurper. The Swarmlord loomed over her, raising its remaining 3 blades for the executioner's stroke. Its 4 eyes, black and devoid of soul, stared down, analyzing where best to sever connection between her head and her body. It was the perfect killer. But in its perfection, it lacked one thing, the capacity for hatred. And Sarah Kerrigan had enough hatred to burn the stars. "Is that all?" The voice did not come from her throat. It erupted from the ground, the air, and the void itself. The Swarmlord hesitated. The blade in Kerrigan's shoulder began to vibrate, then crack. With a scream of rage that shattered the sound barrier, Kerrigan grabbed a saber embedded in her flesh. Her hand glowed with blinding violet radiance, the Omega-level psionic signature that had once challenged the Xel'Naga. She didn't pull the blade out. She shattered it. The explosion of force of the Swarmlord backward, skidding through the mud and gore. Kerrigan rose, the wound in her shoulder knitting together in seconds, the Zerg hyper-regeneration consuming the damage. She floated into the air, her eyes no longer resembling human organs, but twin singularities of pure void energy. The atmosphere around her began to twist. Gravity groaned in protest. "You fight with claws and instincts," she projected, her voice layering over itself in a terrifying harmony. "I am the Queen of Blades. I do not duel. I dominate." The Swarmlord scrambled to recover, sensing the shift in the battle's metaphysical weight. It attempted to channel the shadow in the warp to dampen her power, but the shadow was being pushed back by a storm of impossible magnitude. Kerrigan extended a hand, fingers splayed. She did not cast a bolt of lightning. She gripped the space the Swarmlord occupied. Implosion. The beast roared, a sound of genuine confusion, as invisible, crushing gravity clamps seized its limbs. Its bio-titan armor, capable of withstanding Lascan and fire, began to buckle. The sound was nauseating, wet, crunching pops as the Swarmlord's internal organs were compressed into a singularity. It thrashed, slashing wildly at the air, but there was nothing to cut. Kerrigan clenched her fist slowly, savoring the resistance. Ribs snapped. The skull collapsed inward. The green light in the Swarmlord's eyes flickered and died as its massive form was crumpled into a ball of broken meat and chitin, suspended in the air by her will alone. She had not just defeated the Hive Mind champion. She had crushed it like an insect. The carcass of the Swarmlord dropped to the ground with a wet thud. Silence descended upon the battlefield, absolute and terrified. The Leviathan Tyranids, their synaptic link to the Hive Mind severed by the death of their conduit, stood frozen. Kerrigan descended, her feet touching the pooling ichor of her fallen foe. She placed a hand on the mangled remains, golden tendrils of essence siphoned from her palm, burrowing into the corpse. She didn't just consume the biomass. She drank the data. In a flash of vertigo, the memories of the Swarmlord flooded her mind. The fall of Tyranid, the Battle of Makridge, the Octarius War. She saw the galaxy through the eyes of the Great Devourer. She learned the location of every Splinter Fleet, the weakness of the Astartes gene seed, and the looming threat of the Necron dynasties. She withdrew her hand, her knowledge now spanning 10,000 years of galactic slaughter. She turned to the frozen Leviathan warriors. They did not attack. One by one, the Hormagaunts, the warriors, and even the massive Carnifexes lowered their heads, subverting their instincts to a new, undeniable master. The Civil War was over. The Swarm was whole. The bridge of the battle-barred sword of retribution was a canyon of Gothic iron and sacred silence, broken only by the hum of the ventilation spirits and the heavy breathing of Lord Inquisitor Hestia. She stood before the command dais, the brass key of the exterminatus extremis heavy in her cybernetic hand. The decision had been made. The Tyranid infestation on the moon of Xerxes was no longer a war to be won. It was a tumor to be excised. The Swarmlord defeat had sent a ripple of impossible dread through the task force. If the archenemy could kill the Hive Mind's champion, then the ground war was already lost. Hestia recited the litany of ultimate mercy, her voice cracking with the weight of the billions she was about to sentence to oblivion. Some may question your right to destroy 10 billion people, she intoned, slotting the key into the cogitator's altar. But those who understand realize that you have no right to let them live. She turned the key. The rune of the Inquisition flared angry red. The machine spirit accepted command. There would be no evacuation. There would be no survivors. Only fire. From the ventral bombardment bays of the massive warship, the cyclonic torpedoes were released. They fell like monoliths of judgment, cylinders of adamantium the size of hive spires, engraved with high Gothic script cursing the alien to the void. These were not mere explosives. They were two-stage atmospheric incinerators designed to burrow through a planet's crust and destabilize its core, shattering the world from the inside out. As they descended through the vacuum, followed by the sorrowful gaze of the fleet, they looked like tears of the Emperor himself. The crew watched the hololiths, waiting for the impact flares that would signal the ignition of the atmosphere. Usually, the Tyranid response to Exterminatus was a frantic, futile attempt to flee, biomass ships scattering like roaches before a boot. But the scanners showed no route. The spore chimneys on the surface below did not close. Instead, they pulsed. The planet did not brace for death. It looked up and it sneered. 10,000 zoanthropes, floating in a geostationary orbit formed of living tissue, linked their minds in a chorus of agony and power. Under the direct conducting will of the Queen of Blades, their individual warp signatures were not fired as blasts, but woven together. A lattice of violet energy, a psionic web, materialized in the upper exosphere. It was a shield of impossible complexity, shimmering with the honeycomb pattern of the Zerg Hive cluster. The cyclonic torpedoes, traveling at terminal velocity, struck the barrier. They did not detonate. They were caught. The laws of physics groaned as the kinetic energy of the planet killers was absorbed by the psionic dampening field. The torpedoes hung suspended in the void, nose cones crumbling against a wall of solid will, looking like arrows caught in a spider's web. On the surface, Kerrigan stood on a spire of bone, her eyes bleeding light, holding the weight of the bombardment with a gesture of her hand. She was not merely deflecting the attack. She was denying the Imperium its final argument. Impact negative, the sensor officer whispered, the words sounding like blasphemy. The ordnance has been arrested. They are crushing them. On the main view screen, the horror unfolded in high definition. The psionic web contracted. The cyclonic torpedoes, containing enough power to crack a tectonic plate, were squeezed until their casings ruptured. The warheads detonated. But the explosion was contained within the psionic bubble, a harmless firework display of orange plasma against the purple shield. The bridge of the Sword of Retribution erupted into panic. Captains shouted conflicting orders. Priests fell to their knees weeping, and servitors short-circuited from the logic error of a failed exterminatus. Inquisitor Hestia stared at the screen, her worldview shattering. The exterminatus was the Emperor's wrath made manifest. It was the ultimate trump card. For it to be caught and crushed like a child's toy was not just a tactical defeat. It was a theological catastrophe. "She is mocking us," Hestia hissed, gripping the railing until the metal warped. She didn't just stop it. She wanted us to watch. Lord Inquisitor, gravity wells opening. Hull stress critical. The ship lurched violently, throwing crewmen into the instrument pits. The red alert klaxons changed pitch to the boarding alarm. The planet below was no longer passive. From the atmospheric membrane, massive serpentine tendrils, organic gravity whips, lashed out into the void. These were the Great Devourer mess, evolved from a Nidus strain, capable of exerting localized gravitational pull. The Imperial fleet, attempting to break orbit, found itself caught in a dragging undertow. Engines flared to maximum, burning Promethium in a desperate bid to escape, but the ships were sliding backward. And then came the scourge. Clouds of suicide flyers, smaller and faster than any Tyranid gargoyle, poured from the shield's gaps, enveloping the blinded warships. They targeted the engines, detonating in acidic clouds that ate through void shields. The Sword of Retribution groaned as its prow dipped toward the planet. They were not permitted to leave. They were not soldiers anymore. They were a meal delivery service, dragging itself into the mouth of the Queen. The sky above the contested moon did not merely darken. It was bruised by the entry signatures of gods. The Imperium, having failed with biology and exterminatus, played its final desperate hand, the Collegia Titanica. The clouds boiled away as the drop coffins of the Legio Mortis descended, wreathed in the fires of atmospheric friction. They slammed into the purple sprawling mass of the creep with the force of meteors, the impact shockwaves liquefying lesser Tyranid organisms instantly. From the smoking craters rose the god engines. Leading them was a warlord titan Sanctus Dominus, a walking cathedral of adamantium and hate, standing 60 meters tall. Its war horns blared, a mournful mechanical roar that resonated in the bones of every living thing on the planet, a sound designed to announce the end of worlds. Void shields crackled into life, shimmering like oil on water, displacing the air with the smell of ozone. At its feet, a pack of warhound titans sprinted like hunting dogs, their Vulcan megabolters churning the earth. They had come to trample the infestation under stride. For 10,000 years, nothing had stood before the god engines. But the creep beneath their feet was not passive soil. It was sensing the vibrations, tasting the metal, and relaying the weight of the invaders to the Queen. Simultaneously, the air around the central hive cluster shimmered with the silver light of teleportation flares. The fabric of reality groaned as the elite of the elite, the chapter meant to remain a myth, materialized. The Grey Knights of the Sixth Brotherhood arrived in a storm of psychic lightning. Led by Grand Master Voldus, they were clad in Aegis Terminator armor, inscribed with runes of warding that hurt the eyes of the beholder. They did not come for the swarm. They came for the witch. To them, KERRIGAN was a demon prince of the highest order, a warp entity manifesting in real space. Banish the unclean. Voldus roared, his nemesis demon hammer crackling with blue warp flame. The air filled with the chanting of the Brotherhood, a sonic weapon of faith meant to destabilize the form of any neverborn. Storm bolters thundered, tearing through the elite royal guard that rushed to intercept them. The Grey Knights moved with a synchronization that transcended Brotherhood. They fought as a single mind, a silver wedge driving straight into the heart of the purple corruption. The Sanctus Dominus leveled its arm-mounted volcano cannon at the primary hive spire. The machine's spirit growled, hungry for destruction. The weapon fired. a beam of coherent light hot enough to core a planet. But the spire did not fall. Just as the beam struck, the ground beneath the Warlord Titan erupted. It wasn't a tunnel. It was a mouth, a nidus worm, genetically accelerated to the size of a skyscraper, burst from a crust. This was no mindless beast. It was covered in heavy chitin plates that deflected the Warhound's fire. With a roar that drowned out the Titan's warhorn, the nidus worm coiled around the Warlord's legs. Adamantium groaned and snapped like dry twigs. The Titan's void shields flared and collapsed under the physical contact. The crew inside screamed as the horizon tilted. The worm didn't bite. It crushed. It dragged the God Engine down into the depths of the earth. The Titans reacted going critical in a blinding mushroom cloud that the worm simply swallowed. The Godbreaker had claimed its first offering. In the shadow of the falling Titan, the Grey Knights reached the throne of the Queen. Kerrigan waited for them, hovering a foot off the ground. Her wings relaxed. Voldus stepped forward, channeling the collective psychic might of the squad into a rite of banishment. By the name of the Emperor, I abjure thee. Return to the warp, demon, he bellowed, unleashing a lance of pure sanctic energy. The bolt struck Kerrigan and dissipated like smoke against a wall. She didn't flinch. She laughed. The sound was not the multi-layered voice of a demon, but the sharp, clear mockery of a human woman. You mistake me for your nightmares, she said, stepping through their psychic barrier as if it were cobwebs. I have no true name for you to bind. I am not of your warp. I am flesh. I am essence. She lashed out, not with magic, but with a telekinetic shockwave so dense it cracked their Terminator armor. The Grey Knights, immune to the corruption of chaos, found themselves reeling against a power that was purely, terrifyingly biological. Their wards were useless against a mind that was not a reflection of emotions, but a pinnacle of evolution. The rout was total. The remaining Warhounds, seeing their alpha dragged into hell, began a panicked retrograde firing blindly into the smoke. Voldus, bleeding from his ears as Kerrigan's psionic pressure crushed his mental defenses, realized the tactical impossibility. They could not banish her. They could not kill her. Teleport extraction. Now! He screamed into the Vox. The silver light flared again, snatching the battered remnants of the Brotherhood away just as Kerrigan's wing blades swept through the space where they had stood. The battlefield was left to the silence of the dead and the crackle of burning Titans. Kerrigan stood atop the wreckage of a Warhound's head, the flames reflecting in her eyes. She had faced the machines of the Dark Age and the sorcerers of the Emperor, and she had broken them both. The Imperium had thrown its gods at her, and she had found them wanting. She looked up at the stars, toward the Octarius sector. The test was over. The harvest could begin. Robot Gilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines and Lord Commander of the Imperium, stood in the private scriptum of Hera's fortress on Mackridge. The room was illuminated only by the harsh blue light of a hololithic tactical display, casting long, tired shadows across his patrician features. Before him floated the data slate compilations from the Cordis sector, reports of lost Titans, broken Grey Knights, and a silence that screamed louder than any distress beacon. He scrolled through the pick captures of the Queen, his analytical mind deconstructing the threat with cold, logical dread. The Imperium had spent millennia fighting the Tyranid as a natural disaster, a hurricane of flesh that could be weathered or diverted, but never reasoned with. This was different. This was not entropy. This was ambition. A beast eats until it is full, Gilliman murmured to the empty room, his voice heavy with the weight of a galaxy on fire. A conqueror eats until there is nothing left to rule. He realized, with a sinking feeling in his transhuman hearts, that the great game had changed. The Tyranids were no longer just a biological weapon. They were now a political power capable of strategy, diplomacy, and empire building. The Cordis sector had been quarantined by decree of the High Lords, enforced by the Ultramarines. A cordon sanitarius of 12 light years was established around Kerrigan's new domain. Imperial Navy patrols skirted the edge of the Violet Zone, reporting back with trembling voices. The worlds within were not dead rocks stripped of atmosphere. They were thriving, twisted paradises of alien flora. Orbital rings of grown chitin acted as shipyards, repairing damaged hive vessels with industrial efficiency. The Pax Tyrannicus had settled over the region. There were no rebellions, no chaos cults, no crime, only the absolute, terrifying unity of the swarm. It was a dark mirror of the Emperor's dream. Perfect order, achieved through the total annihilation of the individual self. The shadow in the warp here did not rage. It hummed with calculated frequency, a psychic wall that kept the demons of the Empyrean at bay, not through faith, but through the sheer density of the Queen's psionic presence. Deep within the hollowed-out crust of the capital world, Sarah Kerrigan sat upon a throne woven from the calcified rib cages of the Legio Mortis titans she had slain. The chamber was a biological marvel, a fusion of Zerg organic architecture and Tyranid scale. Bioluminescent sacks hung from the ceiling, bathing the court in a soft, amber glow. She was not alone. Around her scuttled her new advisors, creatures that were neither Zerg nor Tyranid, but genetic chimeras bred for processing data rather than flesh. A creature resembling a bloated brain bug, grafted with Imperial cogitators, shared information about fleet movements and biomass yields. Kerrigan rested her chin on her hand, her wing blades draped lazily over the back of the throne. She felt the distant, scratching hunger of the Hive Mind trying to reassert control, like a radio signal drifting in and out of tune. She crushed it with a thought. She was bored of survival. She had saved one galaxy. Now, she would rule another. Her gaze drifted to the holographic projection of the galaxy map, her eyes locking onto a swirling vortex of green and red violence. The Octaria sector. But as the Queen plotted her expansion, the galaxy reacted to her existence in ways even she had not foreseen. In the cold, lifeless void of the Nephilim sector, deep beneath the surface of a black tomb world, the silence was broken. The presence of an Omega-level psyker of Kerrigan's magnitude, a being whose soul burned bright enough to rival the old ones, had triggered ancient contingency protocols. Green Gauss energy began to arc between black stone pylons. Canoptek scarabs poured from the sands in the billions, waking the legions that had slept for 60 million years. The Necrons were stirring. To the Silent King, the Tyranids were a plague of locusts to be burned, but Kerrigan was something far worse. She represented the return of the Flesh Masters, the psychic dominators that the Necrons had fought the war in heaven to destroy. On the view screen of Awakened Monolith, a glyph flared to life, translating the biological signature of the Queen into a single, hateful designation. Target priority, Vermin God. Kerrigan stood up from her throne, the movement causing her royal guard to hiss in reverence. She walked to the edge of the balcony, overlooking the spawning pools where millions of new, hybrid organisms were being birthed. Creatures with the resilience of the Tyranid and the cunning of the Zerg. She reached out with her mind, feeling the pulse of her new empire, a billion hearts beating in sync with her own. She looked out toward the stars, her vision piercing the veil of space to gaze at the distant fires of the Octarius War, where orcs and Tyranids fought in an endless grinder of attrition. It was a waste of potential. It was a resource waiting to be harvested. A cruel, human smile played on her lips, a terrifying expression on a face that was no longer truly mortal. "The Hive Mind is a slave to its hunger," she whispered, her voice carrying the promise of a new epic. "It eats because it must. I eat because I choose." She clenched her fist, and the purple lights of the Hive City flared in unison. "The Great Devourer hungers. I plan